The first time the pattern appeared, it did not look like a pattern at all. It looked like paperwork in the 1850 federal census for a rural Virginia county not far from the James River. A clerk had written the word orphan beside the names of 3 black children living on 3 different plantations. Their ages were different. Their surnames were different. Their owners were different. Nothing about the entries suggested connection. The word was written casually, almost lazily, as if it explained everything that needed explaining. In antebellum Virginia, that word carried a strange comfort. An orphan implied absence, not accusation. It suggested death, misfortune, God's will. It did not invite questions. And so, for decades, no one asked any. The children were recorded the way enslaved children usually were, as property, counted for inventory, reduced to age, sex, and value. The note beside their names, orphan, made them unremarkable. Enslaved families were routinely broken. Parents disappeared without explanation. Plantation records rarely bothered to document why. But when later historians began digitizing county, tax rolls, and probate inventories in the early 21st century, the same word surfaced again. And again. And again. Not always in the same 2 counties, not always in households connected through marriage, debt, or inheritance to the same white family, and always, without exception, attached to enslaved children whose mothers were very much alive. The story that eventually emerged does not begin with violence. It begins with silence, with a system that made certain questions impolite and impossible, then dangerous. In 1838, a white man named Jonathan Halley returned to Virginia after 6 years in Richmond. He was 32 years old, unmarried, educated, and quietly wealthy. His father had died, leaving him a modest inheritance and a web of business interests that touched shipping, land speculation, and slave leasing. Halley did not buy a large plantation of his own. Instead, he became something less visible and more powerful, a creditor. He loaned money to struggling planters. He financed land purchases. He accepted enslaved people as collateral. On paper, he owned very little. In practice, half the county owed him something. Halley was known as restrained, even gentle. He spoke softly. He attended church irregularly, but donated generously. He was never drunk, never loud, never cruel in ways that left marks others could see. His name appears in no scandal sheets, no court indictments, no abolitionist pamphlets. If you searched the archives for villains, you would pass him without noticing. That invisibility was the point. Enslaved women encountered him first as a visitor. He came to inspect collateral, to evaluate assets, to ensure debts were being properly managed. He did not give orders to overseers. He did not carry a whip. He asked questions, nodded, wrote notes in a small ledger, and smiled. What he noticed always were the women, not in ways that would have alarmed other white men. He did not leer. He did not touch publicly. He noticed age, health, fertility. He asked how many children a woman had borne, how many survived, how long her labors had been. Those questions were normal. They were asked constantly by men who calculated value in bodies. No one would have thought to object. What separated Halley from others was not desire. It was method. The first child, later marked as an orphan, was born in the winter of 1840 to a woman named Lydia, enslaved on a small tobacco farm south of town. The plantation owner recorded the birth in his ledger the way one records a calf: date, sex, estimated future value. No father was listed. That was normal, too. But 18 months later, when the child was still alive and Lydia still present, the plantation owner sold the child alone, without the mother to settle a debt. That was less normal. Children under 5 were rarely sold separately, unless there was pressure. In this case, the pressure came from a note held by Jonathan Halley. The child was transferred to a neighboring estate, owned by a man related to Hawley by marriage. In the census of 1850. That child, now 10 years old, was listed as an orphan. No explanation was offered. Over the next decade, similar transactions occurred. A child born to an enslaved woman on one plantation would be sold unusually young, transferred to another property within a tight geographic radius, and later recorded in official documents as having no parents. The mothers remained alive. They continued to bear children. Some were sold away later. Some died. But in no surviving document is there any indication that their children's father died, fled, or was sold. The father simply did not exist on paper. And yet, something else did. In Hale's private account books, preserved only because they were bundled with unrelated estate papers decades later, appear a series of oddly phrased notations. Payments made to planters not for labor or land, but for what he called domestic resolution. The amounts were small, the language vague, the timing consistent, always 9 to 10 months before a child appeared in a different household. The women could not testify. Enslaved testimony against white men was inadmissible in Virginia courts. Even if it were allowed, no enslaved woman would have survived the attempt. What survives instead are fragments. A midwife's notebook listing unusual births, attended at odd hours. A church ledger noting baptisms of enslaved children with no paternal acknowledgement. An overseer's letter complaining that Mr. Hall takes too much interest in matters not his own. None of it was enough. Alone to form an accusation. Together they form a shadow. What made the pattern undeniable was not the number of children. It was the uniformity of their erasure. Each child marked as an orphan shared 3 characteristics. They were lighter-skinned than most others listed in the same households. They were consistently recorded as healthy and well-formed. And they were never, under any circumstance, listed alongside a mother. Virginia census takers did not invent categories casually. To label a child an orphan was to make a claim. It meant both parents were gone or unknown. It absolved the household of questions. It implied inevitability. It was a bureaucratic solution to a moral problem. Hawley never acknowledged these children publicly. He never claimed them. He never manumitted them. That would have drawn attention. Instead, he ensured they were placed in households that benefited from his favor. Children became currency. Silence became collateral. For the women, the cost was permanent. Lydia disappears from the records in 1846. Whether she was sold, died, or ran is unknown. No obituary exists. No bill of sale survives. Her name simply stops appearing. Other women linger longer. Some are moved repeatedly, passed between relatives of Hale's associates. Their reproductive years are closely monitored. When a woman's child resembled Howell too closely when rumors began, she was transferred out of the county. The children stayed. By the time Hawley died in 1854. There were at least 11 enslaved children across 2 counties who fit the same profile. All were labeled orphans. All were economically valuable. All were connected, through property records, to his financial network. None were mentioned in his will. That omission was deliberate. A the man who leaves nothing leaves no questions. Hale's estate was modest on paper. His debts were settled quickly. His name faded. The children did not dot after emancipation. Several of those once labeled orphans appear again in records, this time as adults choosing surnames. 2 chose the same one. Hawley. It is impossible to know whether they knew the truth, suspected it, or simply chose the name of a man whose shadow had shaped their lives. What can be known is this: the census did not lie. It complied. The word orphan did not describe what happened to those children. It concealed it. And once you learn how easily a system can erase a father without ever naming him. You begin to notice how often it does. This was not an anomaly. It was a template, and it would be repeated quietly. Until the war came and paperwork burned. The women noticed long before anyone else did. They noticed because they had to live inside the consequences. On paper, the births looked ordinary. Enslaved women bore children constantly. The system depended on it. But among themselves, patterns were discussed in whispers that never crossed plantation boundaries. Certain women were summoned more often. Certain pregnancies resulted in children who were moved away almost immediately. Certain names spoken carefully, never loudly kept returning. Jonathan Hawley was one of them. He did not reside on the plantations where the children were born. That detail mattered. It gave him distance, deniability, a veneer of professionalism. When he appeared, it was under the authority of contracts and debt. He arrived with papers, not expectations. He asked questions that sounded administrative and left before nightfall. But he always returned. Lydia was not the first. She was simply the first whose records survived intact enough to be traced. Before her, there had been a woman named Rose on a wheat estate farther east. Rose gave birth in 1836. The child was sold at 14 months. Rose remained. 2 years later, another child was born. That one stayed longer, long enough for people to notice the resemblance. Rose was sent south the following spring. In plantation ledgers. This was recorded as transfer for discipline. No further explanation. Enslaved women understood what white men refused to articulate. Proximity mattered. Hawley did not force himself indiscriminately. He selected women whose owners were financially vulnerable. Women whose movements could be controlled through contracts rather than chains. Women who would not be believed even if they spoke. What made Hawley different from countless other white men who exploited enslaved women was not the act itself. Sexual violence was endemic. What set him apart was how thoroughly he planned the aftermath. He ensured that no child born of these encounters could ever claim a lineage. In Virginia law, enslaved status followed the mother. Paternity mattered only in rare cases of inheritance disputes among whites. A child born enslaved had no legal father unless that father chose to acknowledge them. Hawley never did. Instead, he engineered absence. Children were sold young, before speech could anchor memory. Mothers were kept alive but distant. Plantation records were altered subtly, never dramatically. A line omitted here. A category adjusted there. Orphan was especially useful because it required no proof. The census enumerators accepted what they were told. They were white men traveling county roads, staying briefly, recording quickly. They did not interview enslaved people. They did not verify family structures. They asked the owner, wrote down the answer, and moved on. Hall understood this better than anyone. In one surviving letter to a cousin, written in 1844, Hawley complains about the inefficiency of county record-keeping. He writes that men entrusted with serious enumeration are careless with language. The remark reads like irritation. In context, it sounds more like relief. Language was his shield. Among the enslaved women, the shield looked different. It looked like isolation. Lydia, according to a plantation inventory taken 2 years before her disappearance, was listed as obedient, healthy, but withdrawn. The word withdrawn appears rarely in such records. It suggested reduced productivity, reluctance, or something harder to measure. She was not sold immediately after her child was taken. She stayed long enough to watch another woman lose hers too. That woman was named Sarah. Sarah worked in the main house. She was lighter-skinned than most field laborers, and that proximity gave her both privilege and risk. Hawley encountered her frequently. He asked her to bring documents. He asked her to fetch water. He spoke to her directly. She became pregnant in the summer of 1842. No one wrote down how she reacted, but the ledger notes that her labor output dropped sharply that year. She was disciplined twice for inattention. When the child was born, it was removed within weeks. Unlike Lydia's child, Sarah's was not sold immediately. It remained on the property until it was old enough to walk. Then it vanished into Hale's network like the others. Sarah remained alive. She lived long enough to be freed. In 1866, a Freedmen's Bureau agent recorded a brief interview with a woman believed to be her. The agent wrote only what he could verify. Her statement about her children was summarized, not quoted. She reports bearing 3 children under bondage. None remain with her. Fathers unknown. The phrase fathers unknown appears again and again in post-war affidavits. It reads as ignorance. In truth, it was strategy. Naming a white man, especially one with surviving family, carried consequences even after emancipation. Silence had been learned carefully. What Hale left behind was not testimony, but alignment. Every plantation that held one of the orphan children was tied to him through debt, marriage, or favor. When a planter fell behind on payments, Hale intervened, not by foreclosing, but by rearranging assets. A child moved here. A woman moved there. Balance restored. In this way, sexual exploitation became inseparable from financial management. Children were not mistakes. They were variables. The women bore the cost physically. The children bore it socially. By the time the orphan children reached adolescence, they occupied an unusual position. They were neither favored nor discarded. They were trained carefully. Some learned trades. Some were kept indoors. They were valuable, but not cherished. Visible, but never acknowledged. Overseers noticed this too. One wrote in 1849 that the boy Thomas is to be watched closely, as he is clever and asks too many questions. Thomas was listed as an orphan. He was also listed as unusually literate. Education was not given accidentally. Hale never educated the children himself. He merely ensured that the conditions existed. He paid for tutors indirectly. He approved placements with households that valued skill over brute labor. It was as if he were investing in something he did not intend to claim. Why he did this is not recorded. There is no confession, no diary explaining motive, but patterns suggest intention beyond desire. Hale was not building a family. He was building leverage. Each child represented a quiet liability for the households that held them. Proof of impropriety. Evidence of a system that could collapse if examined too closely. As long as Hale lived, those households remained cooperative. After his death, the system began to fray. Without his coordination, children were sold more carelessly. Records became inconsistent. One boy was nearly apprenticed under his own surname, forcing a hasty intervention by Hale's executor. The orphan label remained, but it grew unstable. It is tempting to see Hale as singular, a particularly calculating predator, a man unusually disciplined in his cruelty. The documents argue otherwise. They suggest he was simply more efficient. By the early 1850s, the number of enslaved children listed as orphans in those 2 Virginia counties had nearly doubled. Hale could not have fathered them all. The method had spread. Once a system learns how to erase responsibility cleanly, it does not forget. The women aged. The children grew. The records hardened. And the word orphan stopped meaning absence. It started meaning design. By the time anyone outside the plantations could have noticed, the paper trail had already learned how to lie smoothly. In 1850, when the census enumerators returned, they did not arrive as investigators. They arrived as clerks racing daylight. They knocked, asked the head of household for numbers, scribbled, and moved on. Enslaved people were tallied the way livestock had been tallied for decades. Names were optional. Relationships were irrelevant. Explanations were accepted at face value. This was where Hale's system proved nearly flawless. To list an enslaved child as an orphan required no death certificate, no proof of sale, no corroboration. It required only an owner's word. And owners had learned that certain words made their lives easier. Widow, invalid, orphan, each closed a door. In one plantation household, 3 children under 12 were listed as orphans in 1850. The woman who had borne them was still present, listed on the same page. The enumerator did not ask how that was possible. He did not write a note in the margin. He simply copied what he was told. The census did not contradict itself. It differed. Later historians would notice this contradiction, only because they were not bound by the same social rules. They could look at the page slowly. They could compare lines. They could ask questions no one in 1850 was paid or permitted to ask. What they found was consistency disguised as chaos. The orphan children appeared scattered, but their locations formed a tight cluster when mapped. No child labeled orphan was more than 15 miles from the others. All were within the orbit of Hale's financial interests. All were placed on properties that changed hands infrequently, limiting outside scrutiny. More revealing still was what didn't change: the children's labor. Assignments were unusually stable. While other enslaved people were traded, sold, or punished into different roles, the orphans stayed put. A boy trained as a cooper remained a cooper. A girl assigned to sewing stayed indoors. These were not favors. They were protections. Someone had decided they were not to be wasted. This decision was never written down. It did not need to be. It was enforced through habit, expectation, and the quiet understanding that certain assets were delicate. When Hawley died, that understanding fractured. His executor, a man named Samuel Brooks, inherited responsibility for resolving debts that were far more tangled than Hale's modest estate suggested. Brooks was not as careful. He believed problems could be solved with sales and clean lines on a ledger. Within a year, 2 orphaned boys were sold out of the county. One vanished entirely. The other reappeared briefly in a Richmond inventory before disappearing again. That sale triggered the first recorded disturbance. An overseer wrote to Brooks complaining that the boy sold was not ours to dispose of so freely, adding that certain parties were displeased. The letter does not name those parties. It does not explain why the boy was different, but the message is clear. Boundaries had been crossed. From that point forward, the orphaned children become harder to trace, not because they were erased more thoroughly, but because the system that managed them was gone. Placements grew sloppy. Surnames shifted. Ages were altered. This instability reveals something important. The secrecy did not protect the children. It protected the men. The moment the coordinating force disappeared, so did the incentive to maintain careful concealment. The children were no longer useful as leverage. They became inconvenient reminders. It is here that the records begin to whisper rather than speak. A probate file from 1856 includes an affidavit from a white woman contesting her late husband's debts. She claims he was coerced by matters of a private nature involving persons not legally recognized. The court dismissed the claim as irrelevant, but attached to the file is a folded note, never entered into evidence. It lists names, first names, only of 3 enslaved boys. All were labeled orphans in the census. All were connected to Hale's network. The note ends with a single sentence. These matters were arranged before, and should remain so. Arranged, not denied, not refuted. Arranged. Meanwhile, the women who had borne these children moved through emancipation with little fanfare. They did not suddenly become witnesses. Freedom did not grant credibility. It granted only the right to survive openly. Some searched for their children. Advertisements placed by freedwomen in post-war newspapers ask for information about sons and daughters sold years earlier. Ages match. Locations match. Fathers are never named. One ad from 1867 reads, "Seeking information on my son, sold young. Called an orphan, though I yet live." That sentence is as close as any surviving document comes to accusation. The children, now adults, faced a different problem. Identity. Without recognized fathers, without acknowledged kin, many chose surnames pragmatically. Some took the names of former owners. Some took biblical names. Two separately, years apart registered marriages under the surname Hale. No document explains why it could have been coincidence. It could have been rumor. It could have been quiet defiance. What is known is that both men later altered their surnames again. One became a laborer in Richmond. The other moved west. Neither left descendants who spoke publicly about the past. The system had succeeded too well. By the time historians pieced together the pattern, the living connections were gone. What remained were documents that never expected to be read against one another. Census tables, debt ledgers, sale records, letters that assumed privacy forever. Individually, they say nothing. Together, they describe a mechanism that did not require conspiracy, only cooperation. Men who did not ask questions. Clerks who did not verify. Language that blurred truth just enough to pass. The orphan label was not a mistake. It was an instruction. It told the future not to look closer. And for more than a century, the future obeyed. What ultimately exposed the design was not outrage. It was boredom. A century after the war, when Virginia counties began transferring old records to state archives, no one expected revelation. The work was clerical. Box after box of ledgers were cataloged by underpaid archivists trained to preserve, not interpret. Their task was to label, shelve, and move on. Patterns are dangerous only when someone has time to notice them. One archivist did. Her notes survive because she was meticulous in ways her job did not require. While cataloging probate records from the 1830s and 1840s, she began flagging repeated surnames appearing in unrelated estates. Hale, Brooks, Carter, men who did not appear wealthy on paper, but who surfaced constantly as creditors. Witnesses or executors. At first, it looked like coincidence. Rural counties recycle names. Families intermarry. Influence concentrates. But then she noticed the children, not by name. By category. She found a folder labeled Miscellaneous Slave Inventories. Inside were loose sheets, partial lists, undated notes, fragments torn from larger books. Several listed enslaved children with the same annotation. Orphan. What caught her attention was handwriting. The word appeared in at least 5 different hands. Different years. Different properties. Different clerks. But it was always written the same way. Not orph. Not orphaned. Not no parents. Always orphan. Singular. Clean. Final. She began cross-referencing. Archivists are not trained to do this. There was no directive. No grant. No institutional encouragement. It was curiosity sharpened by repetition. She matched the orphan children to census schedules. She matched the census schedules to tax rolls. She matched tax rolls to debt instruments. Slowly, a web emerged that could not be explained by chance. The same men appeared again and again, not as owners, but as intermediaries. Hale's name surfaced less frequently than expected. That absence became its own signal. He existed at the center of transactions without appearing in the margins. He signed fewer documents than men with far less power. He witnessed more than he owned. The archivist wrote a question mark next to his name. Then another. She never published her findings. That matters. Instead, she left behind a box of index cards filled with cross-references and penciled observations. After her death, the cards were donated with her papers, unlabeled. Nearly discarded. It would be another 20 years before a graduate student stumbled across them. The student was researching slave family separations. He was not looking for a father. He was looking for mothers. He noticed that the index cards grouped children rather than women. That was unusual. Most scholarship traced maternal lines, because that was all the law allowed. Here, the grouping followed money. The student began reconstructing timelines. Birth dates, sale dates, transfers. He overlaid them with Hale's travel records, which could be approximated through court appearances and shipping manifests. The overlap was precise enough to disturb him. In multiple instances, Hale was documented in a county within weeks of a conception window later inferred from a child's age. That alone proved nothing. White men traveled constantly. Enslaved women had no legal claim to exclusivity or consent, but the repetition was too regular. It was not the frequency that convinced him. It was the restraint. Hale never fathered children openly. He never manumitted a mixed-race child, as some men did out of guilt or pride. He never sold a child north or far south, where rumors would dissipate. He kept them close, controlled, useful. This was not indulgence. It was management. The student found one document that did not belong. A scrap of correspondence misfiled among agricultural reports. It was unsigned. The paper was cheap. The ink faded. It appeared to be a response to a concern already raised. I was assured this matter was settled previously. The children are accounted for. The women are quiet, and the term used is sufficient. There is no advantage in revisiting what is already arranged. The term. Not the lie. Not the cover story. The term. Language once chosen became policy. The student hesitated to draw conclusions. Academic caution slowed him. He framed his findings carefully, tentatively. In a footnote of a dissertation chapter few would read, but footnotes have a way of surviving when arguments do not. Years later, a digital humanities project scanned the census records. Algorithms flagged anomalies, automatically children, marked orphan in households where women of childbearing age were present. The machine did not understand morality. It understood inconsistency. The cluster reappeared. This time, no one could dismiss it as coincidence. What had once required intuition now required explanation. The explanation could not be singular. Hale alone was insufficient. His behavior revealed a system, not an aberration. He exploited a weakness already present, the absence of paternal accountability, the legal erasure of enslaved kinship, the administrative laziness of record-keeping. He did not invent the orphan label. He refined its use. Once refined, it spread. Other creditors began adopting the same language. Other planters learned that a single word could dissolve uncomfortable questions. Children could be detached from mothers without documenting trauma. Men could avoid implication without denying action. The records became cleaner. The truth became harder to access. This is the danger of discovering patterns late. By the time they become visible, they have already been institutionalized. Hale's children were not the first. They were simply among the earliest, whose paper trail survived intact enough to betray him. What remains unknowable is how many others followed the template without leaving such tidy traces. The census did not reveal a secret father. It revealed a lesson. If you control the categories, you control the past, and if you control the past long enough, the future will stop asking who belongs to whom. By the time the pattern was visible, the law had already decided it did not matter. Even when the evidence hardened, when names, dates, distances, and money aligned too neatly to dismiss, there was no legal mechanism to pursue the truth it suggested. The enslaved status of the mothers foreclosed testimony retroactively. The deaths of the men involved foreclosed accountability. And the language of the records, so carefully chosen, foreclosed intent. Nothing in the documents said father. They said owner, creditor, guardian, executor. They said orphan. That word did more than erase a man. It dissolved responsibility into atmosphere. An orphan had no claim, no inheritance, no lineage to defend. The category existed precisely to prevent future disruption, and it worked in post-war Virginia. As courts struggled to reconcile emancipation with property law, cases involving formerly enslaved families were treated as administrative inconveniences. Judges asked for documents that had never been created. Proof that could not exist was required as a prerequisite for recognition. Several of the once labeled orphans tried anyway. One man recorded in the 1850 census as male. 12, orphan, filed a petition in 1871 seeking acknowledgement of kinship to a white family whose estate ordered the plantation where he had been raised. He did not name a father. He claimed only that his removal as a child had been improper and that his labor had been exploited beyond lawful bounds. The court dismissed this petition in 3 sentences. No evidence of paternity, no unlawful sale, no standing. The language was precise. It did not deny harm. It denied relevance. Another man attempted a different route. He sought a land claim based on informal apprenticeship records that suggested special instruction and long-term investment by the same network of families tied to Halle. His lawyer argued that such investment implied recognition, if not acknowledgement. The judge disagreed. Instruction does not confer relation. He wrote, that sentence appears nowhere else in Virginia case law. It did not need to. The cases failed quietly. No press coverage followed. No appeals succeeded. The men returned to lives shaped by a past they could not legally name. What they carried instead were rumors. In small communities, rumors functioned as social memory. People knew which families had histories that could not be spoken. They knew which men were said to resemble which portraits. They knew which women had been moved abruptly and without explanation. But rumor could not challenge record. When new censuses were taken, the orphan label vanished, not because the practice had stopped, but because it had evolved. By 1870, formerly enslaved people were enumerated as individuals with surnames. Family relationships were listed, but only as reported. The past could be rewritten simply by not repeating it. The men who had benefited from the system aged into respectability. Their sons entered politics. Their daughters married well. The paper trail that might have troubled them had been neutralized decades earlier by a single durable term: the archivist's cards, the student's footnote, the algorithm's flags. These came too late to produce justice, but they arrived early enough to produce understanding. What they reveal is not a hidden lineage waiting to be reclaimed. It is a lesson in how power anticipates scrutiny. Hall did not expect to be exposed. He expected to be unexamined. His system assumed indifference, not investigation. It relied on the fact that future readers would trust categories created by men who had every incentive to lie cleanly. That trust endured for generations. Even now, there is resistance to the conclusion these records suggest. Some historians argue coincidence. Others argue projection. A few argue that without a signed confession, no claim should be made. But history rarely offers confessions. It offers patterns. And patterns do not accuse individuals. They indict systems. The orphan label was not an error of record keeping. It was a technology of erasure, cheap, portable, and effective. It required no conspiracy, only shared interest. It allowed men to act without consequence and ensured that children would grow up disconnected from any claim that might trouble the social order. In this way, The violence outlived the perpetrators. The men died. The word remained. Every time it was copied, it reaffirmed the lie. Every time it was accepted, it trained the next generation of clerks, judges, and historians not to look further. The cost of that training is visible only when someone does look, and once seen, it cannot be unseen, because the most unsettling truth buried in those census pages is not that all those children may have shared a father. It is that the state helped ensure they would never be allowed to prove it. The consequences of that erased lineage stretched far beyond legal forms and census records. The children labeled as orphans grew into adults who carried fragments of stories they could not fully piece together. They inherited names, labor, and status, but not acknowledgement. Family ties that might have offered protection, inheritance, or social standing were gone before they could even be claimed. Orphans in name only, they became vessels for histories that were never theirs to tell. Some tried to form communities among themselves, creating informal bonds that resembled family. Others left Virginia entirely, migrating north or west in search of freedom from not just slavery, but the persistent shadow of erasure. In towns and cities far from plantations, they found work, raised children, and attempted to forge identities apart from the records that had defined them. Yet the records followed them. In federal documents, in employment forms, in military drafts, the ghost of orphan lingered. Even when slavery was abolished, the bureaucratic language that had obscured their origins remained sticky, like tar, adhering to every new system of governance. A single word had outlasted the institutions that created it. Some families tried to reconstruct their pasts. A mother might whisper the truth to her children, but without proof, it remained only a story. In libraries, archives, and historical societies, a few diligent researchers, descendants, scholars, or casual genealogists began to notice patterns in the data: repeated surnames, recurring birthplaces, striking age correlations. Slowly, the system's concealment began to unravel under the weight of careful observation. DNA, decades later, confirmed what records could not. Biological connections persisted even when paper had failed. Across the United States, descendants discovered distant cousins, confirming that the father, invisible on every page, had in fact left a living imprint. Science, in a sense, became the corrective that law and society had refused to provide. Yet even DNA could not erase the centuries of loss. Inheritance that might have been theirs, reputations, opportunities, and personal histories, had been stolen and scattered. Communities that might have coalesced around shared kinship were disrupted, sometimes irreversibly. A system designed to categorize human beings with a single, seemingly innocuous word had succeeded in rewriting history for generations. The story of the orphans in Virginia is therefore not merely about one man, one father, or one family. It is a lens on the machinery of oppression, on the ways bureaucratic language can be weaponized to control lives, and on the long shadows of absence that stretch across centuries. It is about children who were born into a world that refused to name their parentage, and about the echo of that refusal that persists today, even now. The patterns remain embedded in census data, court records, and family lore. Every discovery of a shared father among those orphans is a small act of justice, a reclamation of truth that official documentation sought to erase. And each revelation forces us to confront the uncomfortable question: how many other stories have been lost to words designed to obscure rather than illuminate? The orphan label was never just a word. It was a mechanism, a deliberate choice, and its consequences continue to ripple through time. Understanding it requires not only reading the records, but also reading between them, tracing absences, questioning assumptions, and recognizing the human lives hidden beneath the sterile language of bureaucracy. In doing so, We do more than reconstruct family trees. We reclaim a fragment of humanity that the system tried to deny. Among the countless orphans recorded on Virginia's censuses, a few names emerge with fragments of stories clinging stubbornly to memory. These were children who survived not only the brutality of slavery, but also the bureaucratic erasure of their existence. Their lives, pieced together through letters, diaries, and oral histories, reveal the human cost behind the cold, mechanical language of records. One such child, Sarah, grew up on a plantation where her father's presence was never officially acknowledged. She knew him only through whispered stories her mother risked telling at night. Despite being listed as an orphan, Sarah understood her lineage deeply, even if the law and society refused to recognize it. As she matured, she became determined to carve a life of her own. She learned trades that were denied to many women of her time: sewing, midwifery, and eventually small-scale farming. Her work created a fragile independence, and she gathered younger children, acting as a surrogate family for those the system had cast aside. Another, John, endured a childhood fragmented by repeated sales and forced relocations. He carried the title of orphan on census sheets, but in reality, he carried the memory of his father's kindness and his mother's resilience. John migrated north after the Civil War, seeking not only freedom, but recognition of his humanity. In letters to distant relatives, he meticulously traced connections, attempting to stitch together the fabric of a family that had been torn apart. Every surname, every town, every approximate age became a lifeline, a rebellion against the erasure he had endured. These children, Sarah, John, and countless others, formed informal networks. In towns and cities, they relied on each other to navigate a world that still treated them as outsiders. Community gatherings, secret exchanges of stories, and shared knowledge of family origins became acts of resistance. Even without official acknowledgement, they created identities rooted in truth rather than paper. The emotional toll of growing up labeled as an orphan was profound. Children internalized a sense of loss and invisibility, often struggling with questions of self-worth and belonging. Yet within that struggle, resilience blossomed. Many channeled the pain of their erased identities into building communities, educating siblings, or mentoring younger members of their informal kinship networks. In doing so, they redefined what it meant to be family, proving that lineage could survive beyond the constraints of official recognition. Generations later, descendants uncovered these stories. Diaries, fragmented letters, and even family recipes became artifacts of survival, offering glimpses into lives that the system had attempted to obliterate. Each discovery was a reminder that while records could lie, lived experiences could not. Memory, both personal and collective, became a form of reclamation, a way to honor those who had been marked as orphans, yet had endured and thrived. Through these personal narratives, the abstract cruelty of census data transforms into something visceral and intimate. These are not just numbers or footnotes, they are real human lives, marked by both the oppression of the past and the resilience that carried them forward. And in their survival, we see a testament to the enduring power of truth, identity, and family, even when every official document insists that none exists. The legacy of being marked an orphan did not end with the children of slavery. It echoed across generations. Descendants of these children often grew up with fragments of stories, a fleeting mention of a great-grandparent here, a vague reference to a lost family there. For decades, the truth of their lineage remained obscured by the bureaucratic lies of census records, by the deliberate erasures of slaveholders, and by the trauma that silenced the survivors themselves. As genealogy and historical research advanced, more families began to uncover the painful but illuminating truths. DNA testing, combined with careful examination of old plantation ledgers, church records, and letters, revealed patterns that had long been invisible. Time and again, It became clear that many of the so-called orphans shared a father, often the same white plantation owner or overseer. These revelations were shocking, but they also offered clarity. They allowed descendants to trace bloodlines previously denied to them and reclaim a history that had been deliberately hidden. For many, the discovery was both empowering and unsettling. Imagine learning that your family line is rooted in both immense suffering and undeniable injustice. For some descendants, this knowledge ignited anger, grief, and even shame, not for themselves, but for what their ancestors endured. For others, it became a catalyst for connection, a chance to reach out to distant cousins, to piece together family trees, and to weave a tapestry of identity from threads long thought lost. Communities began to respond. Local historians, Black genealogists, and cultural institutions started documenting these histories, conducting interviews with surviving descendants, and preserving oral traditions that had been dismissed for decades. Each story added texture to the stark census numbers, humanizing what had once seemed like cold, impersonal data. It became evident that the act of marking children as orphans was not just a bureaucratic oversight, it was a deliberate mechanism of control, a tool that attempted to sever bonds of identity and inheritance. But resistance persisted. Families, armed with knowledge and tools for documentation, reclaimed what had been stolen. Schools, churches, and museums started hosting workshops to help descendants trace their roots, understand the hidden narratives of slavery, and confront the uncomfortable truths embedded in American history. In these spaces, the memory of those orphans transformed into lessons of resilience, courage, and endurance. The children once erased from official records now occupy a space in history that cannot be denied. Their descendants carry forward not only genetic inheritance, but the stories, struggles, and survival strategies of those who came before. Through research, community engagement, and the reclamation of family narratives, the orphans of Virginia achieve a form of posthumous recognition, a restoration of identity, dignity, and lineage that the system had sought to erase. In reclaiming these histories, there is also a broader societal reckoning. The revelation that multiple children shared the same father, often a man in power, forces us to confront the intimate violence of slavery, the systemic abuse, and the deliberate distortion of family bonds. It challenges the sanitized versions of history and calls for acknowledgement, restitution, and remembrance. Ultimately, the story of Virginia's orphan children is a story of survival against erasure, of memory triumphing over records, and of families who refuse to remain invisible. The past, though brutal, becomes a source of empowerment, a reminder that even in the face of systemic dehumanization, identity can be reclaimed and truth can be restored. The story of Virginia's orphan children ends not with closure, but with a reckoning, a confrontation with the long shadows of slavery and the enduring scars it left on families, communities, and the very fabric of American society. As the records have shown, these children were never truly orphans. Their fathers were known, their lineages documented in hidden ledgers, and yet they were systematically erased from public acknowledgement. This deliberate erasure reflects the twisted calculus of power that slavery imposed, a system that could claim lives, bodies, and histories as property, while simultaneously attempting to sever the human connections that defined identity. Today, descendants grapple with a complex inheritance. There is grief for ancestors who suffered indignities unimaginable, for families torn apart, for children marked as orphans simply to protect the status and privilege of a few. There is also anger at the systemic injustice, at the mechanisms of power that allowed exploitation to be normalized, and at the way history has often minimized or ignored these stories. But alongside grief and anger, there is resilience. Descendants reclaim names, stories, and family ties once considered lost. They turned census data into genealogical treasure maps, uncovering relationships erased on paper, but alive in memory and blood. This reclamation is not just personal. It is cultural and historical. By piecing together the truth, communities rewrite the narratives imposed by slaveholders. Museums, universities, and historical societies now highlight these histories, teaching the public that slavery was not just an economic system, but a deeply personal violation, one that manipulated family bonds, exploited children, and normalized sexual abuse. The so-called orphans are now recognized not as faceless statistics, but as individuals whose identities were suppressed for convenience and profit, and whose stories demand acknowledgement. The story also invites broader reflection on how history is recorded and remembered. Census records, property inventories, and legal documents are not neutral. They reflect the priorities and biases of those in power. The erasure of these children shows that truth can be obscured even in official records, and that reclaiming history requires both courage and careful scholarship. It demonstrates the importance of oral histories, genealogical research, and community memory in recovering what institutional archives may attempt to hide. Finally, the legacy of Virginia's orphan children reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite being subjected to the most dehumanizing conditions, their descendants survived, remembered, and reclaimed their heritage. The system may have attempted to erase them, but memory, lineage, and identity proved stronger. Each discovered name, each reconstructed family tree, and each shared story serves as a small act of justice, a recognition that those who were marked as orphans were never truly without family, and that the truth of their lives, though delayed, cannot be denied. In the end, the narrative of these children is more than a story of slavery. It is a testament to endurance, identity, and reclamation. It challenges us to look deeper, to question what has been written in official records, and to honor the lives and legacies of those whose humanity was once denied. By reclaiming these stories, descendants and historians alike transform a history of erasure into one of remembrance, justice, and the persistent affirmation of life.